The third region of the brain that we will discuss is the brainstem, shown here in green, and it is aptly named as it resembles a stem. Notice that the brainstem is inferior to the diencephalon and it is superior to the spinal cord. In fact, any signals passing between the brain and the spinal cord have to cross the brainstem. There are three parts of the brain that you should be able to identify: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. This is a separate figure which I'm going to use to identify the various structures of the brainstem that you are responsible for identifying. I'm going to start inferiorly and work my way superiorly. I like to think of the brainstem as like the throat of the brain. If you imagine this is the head of the brain and this is the throat. The bottom of the throat would be the medulla oblongata. Notice that it is attached directly to the spinal cord. The Adam's apple of the throat would be the pons. It's round. It has always reminded me of the Adam's apple. This general region in here is the midbrain. I guess it's called that because it's sort of in the middle of all this. But nevertheless, it's called the midbrain, and there are several structures that you must be able to identify. The cerebral peduncles are a large mass of white matter, fiber tracts here. Notice we've got this structure here with two bumps, sort of looks like a butt. It's called the corpora quadragemina, and students often have challenges pronouncing this. Let's break this word down. Quadra, quad, four. Gemina, Gemini, twins. The person who named this structure thought it looked like two sets of twins. Now you may be saying, well, wait a minute, I only see two protrusions here. Remember, you're looking at a mid-sagittal section, so there's actually four, two on each side. So that's where the quad comes from. And so you have these two bumps, one on each side, so they look like two pairs of bumps. So that's where the gemina comes from. So corpora quadragemina. I tell students all the time, it just looks like a butt. So the structure that looks like a butt in the brainstem, that's the corpora quadragemina. Recall the third ventricle. The third ventricle is a cavity that contains cerebral spinal fluid. That cerebral spinal fluid flows through the cerebral aqueduct into the fourth ventricle. That's another cavity anterior to the cerebellum that contains cerebral spinal fluid. And those are the structures of the brainstem that you must identify. Now let's find these structures on the human brain model. Here's our medulla oblongata here. Here's this round structure here, of course, is the pons. Here's our cerebral peduncles. This structure looks like a peduncadunk. Is, yep, our corpora quadragemina. Third ventricle of the diencephalon is here. Here is that cerebral aqueduct. Here is the fourth ventricle. Easy peasy. And now let's look at the brainstem on the sheep brain. This is a sagittal section of the sheep brain. This is the medulla oblongata here. This would be the spinal cord here, where it gets thin. Spinal cord, where it begins to thicken. That's the medulla oblongata. This is the pons. This area would be the midbrain here. You do not have to identify the cerebral peduncles, though I suppose they would be here. You should be able to identify the peduncadunk, though. That's the corpora quadragemina. Here's our two bumps. 1, 2. The corpora quadragemina is just posterior to the pineal gland or pineal body. I thought it would be easy enough to identify the cerebellum and arbor vitae on the human brain model and the sheep brain at the same time. On the left, top left, we have the human brain model. Here we have the cerebellum here, a little darker in color on this model compared to the cerebrum. On the on the whole sheep brain, here we have the cerebellum separated from the cerebrum by this transverse fissure. On the right, we have sagittal sections. Here we have a sagittal section of the human brain model. Here we have the cerebellum. And inside the cerebellum, the arbor vitae, tree of life. And as you can see, very much looks like a shrub. Bottom right, we have a sagittal section of the sheep brain. Here is the cerebellum, and the white matter inside is the arbor vitae. And in the sheep brain, it looks very much like a shrub. Now, how will I distinguish between cerebellum and arbor vitae? So in other words, how can you tell if I'm asking you to identify the cerebellum or the arbor vitae? The cerebellum is one of the 4 regions of the brain. So if I'm asking you to identify the cerebellum, the question I will ask will be, name that region, or what is the name of this region? If, on the other hand, I am asking you to identify the arbor vitae, I will word the question like, name that white structure. The final region of the brain is the cerebellum. The cerebellum has some similarities with the cerebrum in that you have 2 of them, one on either side of the midline, and the outer region or cortex is thrown into folds similarly to the folds of the cerebrum. Students often mix the cerebrum and the cerebellum up because they both begin with C-E-R-E. So it's very common for students to mix up cerebrum with cerebellum. The way I distinguished between the 2 when I was first learning the anatomy of the brain was to notice that the largest region, the cerebrum, has the shorter name. And the smaller region, the cerebellum, has the longer name. And that allowed me to make sure I didn't mix the 2 up. So cerebrum, smaller name, but largest region by far. Cerebellum, much larger name or longer name, but smaller region, much smaller than the cerebrum. The only structure that you have to know of the cerebellum is the arbor vitae. That is this white matter that's deep in the cerebellum. Arbor vitae means tree of life because the structure is shaped somewhat like a tree.